Welcome back. In this episode of Wicked Leadership, I wanted to have a look at in more detail in some of the ideas that I covered in an earlier video on sustainable issues in business, particularly around climate change. And in this video, I'm going to have a look at why resilience is key to coping with climate change in business. I'm going to have a look at business risks associated with climate change. I'm going to have a look at resilience as the core of business strategy. I'm going to look at the need to scale up investment in climate change mitigation efforts alongside efforts to adapt. And I'm going to look at the need to communicate with stakeholders referring to actions on climate change and how we need to work with others to better support business decision making in the context of climate change. And finally, the need to advocate for business climate resilience. So in the earlier video, I said this again, resilience is the key. And this comes out of the work of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And what they said in the report in 2019 was that companies need to prepare for both the physical risks that are associated with climate change, as well as the associated transition risks on the path to an economy that is net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Businesses need to integrate their climate change risks into their enterprise risk management processes and factor climate action into their decision-making processes. Practically, what this means for businesses is that, in the words of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, they need to understand and assess business risks associated with climate change, put climate change resilience at the core of business strategy, scale up investment in climate change mitigation efforts alongside efforts to adapt to climate change, communicate with stakeholders referring to actions on climate change, work with others to better support business decision making in the context of climate change, and advocate for business climate resilience to build capability and capacity across and between business sectors. So, business risk associated with climate change. Business risk management is mature, highly professional discipline supported by international standards. Its maturity is reflected in the emerging awareness that climate-related enterprise risk has prompted efforts to integrate the analysis of climate change risk into enterprise risk management systems, as well as financial decision-making and disclosures. The substantial challenge for corporates in accommodating climate change risks is how to assess future climate risk. Addressing this issue requires understanding how the climate will change across time and spatial scales that vary between business entities. It's a complex problem. Unfortunately, the algorithms that are required to enable climate science to inform assessments of how climate change will impact financial and broader business risks are only partially developed. Now, the desire of governments, regulators, standards organisations and businesses to assess climate risk requires hastened understanding of the uses and limitations of climate modelling. The methods need to be transparent and open to scrutiny, but there are at the moment too few mechanisms to ensure that this will happen, which is something that I agree with. And this goes back to an old problem of the tension between the academic world and the business world. In other words, the conceptual gap between business needs and climate science is presently a bit too wide. It's getting better, but it's still a little bit too wide. And bridging the gap requires elevating climate modelling from a research pursuit to an operational enterprise. The emergence of professional climate change services, akin to or part of meteorological services, should enable the open discussion of what's feasible, counter systemic overconfidence in global circulation models, and better identify by global circulation climate models are valuable tools, among other things. The financial sector, regulators and businesses have heard from climate science that climate change presents a real and present danger, Their awareness has translated to a need to measure and assess climate risk at a level of detail that isn't presently delivered routinely, or which requires considerable climate model development to meet the full suite of financial needs. To meet the needs of the financial sector, regulators and businesses, climate projections need to be developed, undertaken and provided at the same level of professionalism as weather services. If we look back to some of our earlier discussion of climate change's commercial impact, businesses need to systematically assess and mediate climate change risks associated with potential physical challenges, mainly related to extreme weather events, which affect business continuity, potential changes in demand for goods or services, or new products or services, potentially driving market changes, potential changes in market valuation and subsequent potential effects on reputation, and potential changes in operational costs and investment opportunities driven by regulatory change. Businesses further need to prepare for transformational change driven by the inevitable shift to carbon neutrality. In short, they need to become more resilient. So, let's take a look at resilience as the core of business strategy. Yusuf Nassif, who's the director of the adaptation program at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Secretariat, at least he was in 2019, said, "Cultivating and sustaining climate resilience is commensurate with sound business practice. Beyond bolstering the long-term competitiveness of companies, it helps them to establish new and constructive connections with surrounding communities and to forge new levels of adaptive collaboration across businesses facing similar climate impacts." The World Business Council for Sustainable Development argues that business climate resilience requires developing and implementing strategies that address mitigation, adaptation, and transformation. Now, first, developing and maintaining appropriate mitigation efforts is foundational to climate resilience. Progressing mitigation efforts make businesses less vulnerable to disruptive risks, for example, policy and legal measures, resource scarcity, or market variations. In the long term, climate risk mitigation efforts enable companies to reduce the costs of adaptation to climate-related physical impacts. As a result, mitigation seems to be driving a surge of climate actions companies are making worldwide. Secondly, as discussed earlier, businesses are adapting to ensure business continuity in the face of climate-related physical risks. They systematically assess and evaluate climate-related physical risks through operations, supply chains, and across the communities in which they operate. And finally, businesses must assess their dependencies on and value to society and nature. Further identifying and deepening connections, dependencies, and interrelationships between climate and society, climate and nature, and climate and sustainable development enhances societal pressure on businesses' purpose and the role of business in society. Businesses should encourage policy measures that provide political and economic priority to activities with the best outcomes for society and the environment. Assessing a company's value to society and nature is a challenging task, and one part of that is looking at what is called ecological economics. So how do we scale up investment in climate change mitigation efforts alongside efforts to adapt? It's fair to say that good infrastructure management is required for resilient infrastructure, but targeted actions are also needed. So we've got this tension between what we need to do to mitigate climate change and also what we need to do to adapt. So that's why we need to talk about infrastructure resilience. And the problem is that no single intervention renders infrastructure systems resilient. Instead, you need a range of coordinated actions. Remember, I've talked about wicked problems before. It's not about a single solution. They are complex, sometimes chaotic. So we need more than one solution to come into play to actually help to address the problem. Countries need to get the fundamentals right. Proper planning, operation and maintenance of their assets increases resilience and save costs. But sound design and management alone aren't enough to make infrastructure resilient. This is especially true in the context of rare and high-intensity hazards on long-term trends like climate change. Regulators working together with businesses must define institutional mandates and strategies for infrastructure resilience. We must introduce resilience into regulations and incentive systems of infrastructure sectors, users and supply chains. Regulators and firms must improve decision-making data, tools and skills. And appropriate financing, especially for risk-informed master plans, asset design and preparedness, must be available. Actions on these issues can be highly cost-effective and transformational. Nevertheless, they can be challenging to fund in developing countries, arguably making them international aid priorities. So, how do we communicate with stakeholders referring to actions on climate change? Climate change poses significant current and future financial challenges and opportunities for investors. The expected transition to a lower carbon economy is estimated to require approximately $1 trillion of investment annually for the foreseeable future, generating new investment opportunities. Simultaneously, the risk return of commercial climate-related risk exposure will change significantly. Hence, organisations will be more affected by the physical impacts of climate change, climate policy and new technologies. This suggests that investors may not avoid climate-related risks by moving out of certain asset classes, as a wide range of asset types could be affected. So, both investors and the organisations in which they invest should consider their longer-term strategies and most efficient allocation of capital. Organisations that invest in activities that may not be viable in the longer term may be less resilient to the transition to a lower carbon economy, and their investors will likely experience lower returns. Compounding the effect on longer term returns is the risk that present valuations don't adequately factor in climate-related risks because of insufficient information. As such, long-term investors need adequate information on how organisations are preparing for a lower carbon economy. Now remember, business stakeholders are not solely shareholders. There are creditors, suppliers, regulators, customers, leaders, managers and employees, and they all have a very obvious interest in the impact of climate change too. Beyond these groups lies society at large. Citizen satisfaction with stakeholder activities is an important factor in ensuring the participation of citizens in climate change actions. A majority of citizens are dissatisfied with the actions of governments. They're more satisfied with environmental organisations, NGOs and scientists. The current need to respond to climate change requires urgent action to be taken both by the stakeholders involved in addressing climate change and by citizens. However, for citizens to be able to take part in such actions, directly or indirectly, they'll need to have a positive perception of the relevant stakeholders, so that a mutual relationship of trust and understanding is established. Hence, the development of a commitment to and effective communication of climate change policies that align with the Paris Agreement and subsequent agreements on climate change is required worldwide. Whilst a majority of the developed nations have taken the lead in setting ambitious targets, a small minority, led by populist governments, seem to be holding out, although that seems to be changing slowly more recently, since political peer pressure seems to have eroded the holdouts' positions. Developing countries struggling with growth point to the competitive advantage enjoyed by the developed world resulting from highly polluting economic behaviour in the past. This is a complicated, wicked problem. It's a complex, wicked problem that resists easy resolution. So how can we work with others to better support business decision making in the context of climate change? Well, no single company can address the climate challenge alone. To be effective, companies need to join forces with others to find effective solutions that help drive systemic changes across markets. By effectively managing relationships, businesses can unlock access to valuable resources for climate change adaptation. And the dynamic and interdependent nature of business relationships calls for business adaptation efforts to focus on the development of collaborative and joint problem-solving approaches. This is, of course, challenging, another wicked problem. Companies need to engage in give-and-take exchange relationships with other companies to address climate change. And it's been found that companies fail to collectively respond to climate change because of multiple conflicting interests of actors within networks. And these conflicts are aggravated by economic reasoning through which network actors fail to assess long-term benefits of joint climate mediation action, preferring instead to take short-term individual benefits, competition getting in the way of mutually beneficial relationships, and differing perceptions of the rules of the game. That is, network actors tend to focus on individual responses whilst failing to collectively respond to climate change. Again, this suggests the negative impact of the different perspectives of actors when attempting to craft collective action. Working with others to address climate change seems also shaped by cultural orientations. Individualists tend to perceive climate change as intractable, and they are less likely to take climate-friendly action than those with a more collectivist orientation. So, how can we better advocate for business climate resilience? The World Business Council for Sustainable Development argues that the private sector can initiate and further increase action on resilience across entire sectors and economies. They further argue that by sending strong climate action messages, companies can help accelerate adaptation. In addition, they argue that, whether individually or through strategic collaboration, companies must reinforce the momentum around the need for more mitigation and adaptation, sending clear signals to policy makers and markets. In the midst of the Trump presidency, it was found that the US federal government backed away from its Paris Agreement commitments, and many corporate executives recognised the need to address the greenhouse gas emissions of their companies. They further saw the business logic of strong environmental, social and governance practices more generally. In the lead up to the Paris Conference of the Parties in 2015, corporate leaders were asked about past and current experiences with carbon pricing. The questions probed implementation policies and procedures, information used to create support for the concept within the company, pressures from investors and other stakeholders, and activities and plans to engage in public policy advocacy. Leaders indicated that 3 core practices were critical in advancing climate change leadership efforts: securing and maintaining top leader support, embedding the work within the organisational culture, and collaborating with like-minded companies. If you'd like to learn more on about what I do, which is helping people to, or rather equipping people to tame wicked problems, such as climate change within businesses, please take a look at any of the links below. I'd be particularly interested if you want to take a look at the Wicked Scorecard, which will help you get a grasp on the state of your work-life environment.